Hello everybody, my name is Andrew. I hope you're all having a great day, and in this video, if you fancy joining me on the adventure, we will be building an advice generator app, courtesy by Frontend Mentor. This is a really nice app. It basically fetches advices after pressing this little green button at the bottom, and it involves some HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript and APIs. We will be using the advice slip JSON API to fetch some random advices after pressing the button. So before we get started, we can have a look at the final product, and that's it here. So we have this nice little title. The advice ID or number is also returned by our API. Then we have the actual advice and the button to press. And I focused on having some nice animations in this component, in this challenge. And so you can see once you hover over this button, then it kind of pulsates and has this nice box shadow. And once you press it, you will see there is this rotation and it slides out, fetches a new advice and slides back in. Let's do this once again. The dice rotates, the advice goes out and goes in again. You can also see that the advice number has some subtle animation. It's also a combination of fading in and out and also sliding in and out. So yeah, this is still a really simple component, but I think there are really nice takeaways from building that. And in the challenge, we will be using only plain HTML, CSS and JavaScript. No frameworks or libraries, no dependencies, just good old web technologies. All right, if you're ready, let's dive in. I already created a folder, advice generator, on my computer, and this one has an images folder with assets from Frontend Mentor. So if you go over register and create an account, you can download the assets and everything is ready for you to go. So you don't have to create any SVGs or images. I also have the Figma files with the design, so I can take my values like the font size, the background colors, and so on from this Figma file. We have 3 different screens. The first one is just the default screen. Then at the bottom there is the hover state of the button. And again, this is up to interpretation, right? Everybody can do it a bit differently. I chose to go with animations and having this pulse animation. But if you want to solve this on your own, then feel free to do whatever transitions or animations you prefer. And on the right side, we also have the mobile screen. So this is more or less responsive. This container just scales with the maximum viewport width and nothing too fancy, but we will still try to tackle this in a nice manner. Awesome. Let's go back and start with our files. And in this case, we need 3 files. The first one is the HTML file. Next is our styles. And finally, we have our script.js for the fetching logic. Awesome. Again, I like to start by writing HTML. So let's create our document, give it a nice title like advice generator, and we also need to link to our style sheet, styles.css, and to our fav icon. Again, this is an icon, not a style sheet. It has the sizes of 32 times 32 pixels, and the type is an image/png. Finally, we go into our images folder and select fav icon 32 by 32.png. Awesome. I also want to give it a description. This is not really important in this very example because this app is not going to be indexed by any search engines, but just as a best practice and for some memory training, we can add a meta description in here, which once you write an actual website, will come in handy for SEO purposes. So this is the solution to the advice generator challenge on Frontend Mentor. Awesome. And let's give this some spacing. I like to group my meta tags, have the title then and my link and whatnot. And let's head over into our body. And again, I will use a main tag because this component here is the only content that we have on the page. So it's the main landmark. Hence, I am going with the main tag. And the next thing we will have is our title. This might be misleading. Some people eventually choose the quote to be a title, but I think this one makes much more sense, even though from the UI perspective it looks smaller and less important than the quote itself. But from a semantical point of view, this advice number 117 is the actual title, followed by the quote. So this is the H1 set. This is our first heading on the page. And I will give this advice and let's say 117 in here. And later on in the course, we will make this dynamic. Then let's have a block quote with the text inside. So I will just choose lorem ipsum for now, and this will be replaced later on by our API call result. Cool, then we have the separator here. This is actually an SVG image. If you look into our images, you can see that we have two for desktop and mobile, pattern divider. There are many options to go with that. You could choose a background image. In my case, I'm using this HR element to also have the semantical separator, and later on in the CSS we will give this a background image of our divider in here. And finally we have a button at the bottom which will contain our SVG dice. It's this file here. So we can go ahead and type button, and so there are two ways we could, or actually three ways. We could have this as a background image. We could use the image tag and point to images / icon dice SVG. But in my case, I am going with inline SVG. So let's copy this code, paste it in here. And right now it has a fill of this hex code, which is okay. But I like to go with current color, which means that the SVG will take the same color as the button has. Like if the button has a color of red, the SVG will also be red. In this demo or in this example, it's not very important because there is not any hover state that changes the color. We don't have button variants, but still as a best practice and muscle memory, I always try to use current color so that it is pretty easy to maintain once you get more button variants and whatnot. So let's save this. And since we don't have any text in the button, and screen readers that wouldn't know how to pronounce or how to announce the button, what it does, what action is behind it, I want to add an area label and say that get new devices should be its value. So whenever a user with a screen reader enabled browses this page and focuses the button, it will read that get new devices is the action. And sorry, it's advices, not devices. Yeah, this is the action for this button. And then it's pretty clear what this is about. All right. And I think that's already it for our markup. Again, it's really, really simple. So nothing much to it. Let's have a look in our browser. I will open it in my live server extension in VS Code. And this is looking nice. Well, not yet, but it's a good start, I think. So we can put this to the right and our editor to the left, hide my sidebar. And there's one more thing to do, which is to include the script source of my script file. So this will be pointing to script.js, and I will add the defer attribute. Let's save and head into our DevTools, and let's see, there is no error, everything is green, awesome. Then I would like to continue by writing my styles for this application. And we can go into our styles.css, and we can also delete our icon dice since we have it in our HTML and don't need it in here. And yeah, let's start writing some CSS. The first thing I like to start with is creating my variables or CSS custom properties. So I will use or set them on the root selector, and we have 4 colors, and you can also see those colors in here. I don't know why there were 5, but if you download the challenge from Frontend Mentor, it actually mentions just 4 colors: the background of the body, the background of this card or component, then our accent color, which is the neon green, and finally the text color, which is the light gray or light cyan. So yeah, I will go with those 4 colors, and the first one I am calling color text. I'm using the HSL namespace, and it is 193 in hue, 89%, 38% in saturation, and 86% in lightness. Next we have color accent. This is our neon green color. Again, HSL. This time we have 150, 100%, and 66%. Next is color, what is it? Body background, HSL to 19, 22, and 16%. And finally we have color card background, which is a slightly lighter gray. So we have 217, 19, and the 24% of lightness. Again, naming colors or generally naming things in programming is hard. In this case, I chose to go with a descriptive name. So I straight away know that this is for my text and this are my accent color. I could also give this color green as a name, but let's say in half a year I return to this code and I change it from green to blue, then I would have to change the name to blue as well and find and replace all occurrences of this variable in my CSS code, which I don't want to. So I am going with the accent color, and I can then change any values in here. It's my accent color, it's just different, and I don't have to do anything else. So let's go with that and create our fonts next. So I will copy this comment and go rename this to fonts. And we will be using Google Web Fonts here. The font family is called Manrope. So we can head over to fonts.google.com and Google for or search for Manrope. And there it is. We just need one font weight, which is 800. And you can check this out by double clicking on the design and the Figma file, and you will see that the weight of the font is 800, which is also true for the advice. So that's pretty simple to download. Let's remove the previous font and select this style. And what I like to do is I like to download my fonts into a local folder, so I don't have to rely on Google CDN or any other CDN for that matter. So let's make the button visible, download the family. And what I also like to do is instead of writing this font face declaration manually, I let Google do the work for me. So I already have this selected. Let's make this, oops, not this one. Let's make the browser window a bit bigger. And have this, I think it is selected, yeah. How can I use it? There it is. So yes, so we have the Manrope selected, weight 800. And what I will do, I will just copy this URL and paste it inside my browser. And then I can steal the code from Google and put it inside my CSS. So instead of writing it out manually, we can use it like that. I don't need my quotes because Manrope is just one word. There is no space in between. Font style is normal, 800. And we have to go and change the path to /fonts and then it's manrope. I will be using WOF2 as the format. And what I find nice is that Google provides a Unicode range, which basically tells the browser for which characters or glyphs to use this font. And sometimes this can result in some performance improvements because the browser doesn't have to download the font each time without you using it eventually. So typing this out manually is a nightmare, which means that I much better off just copy and pasting this from Google. I assume they know what they are doing by putting this all here. Let's close the tab, make this smaller again, and we have to go into our downloads folder. So I will quickly open that and extract manrope font. There is my static folder with my TTFs, and I will choose the bold one and move this inside a new folder called fonts. Not like that. Okay, and there we go. I just pasted it inside my code folder manually. I don't know what's wrong with VS Code. Sometimes it behaves really stupid when trying to move files over. But as you see, this is still in the TTF format, but for our code, we want to have the WOF2 format. And what I do in this case is relying on a nice package called ttf2wof2. So I will go into my fonts folder and I will say cut manrope bold ttf, pipe it over to my installed package of 2 and output it as a new file called manrope bold.wof2. And if we go into our folder explorer, there it is. Nice and easy. Let's delete our TTF file, close out the explorer, and there we go. Done. Next, that's it with the font already. Next, we can go over and create our base styles. And for this one, as always, I will start by writing or selecting all elements and their before and after pseudo elements and say box sizing, border box to make my layouting a bit easier. And then I will paste in something that is nice for accessibility reasons. Some users, they don't want to see all those animations because it can make them dizzy. Maybe they have a disability, and so in some operating systems you can set a flag or you can set a setting to disable animations on web browsers. And so we have a media query which is quite new, and it listens for this preference, prefers reduced motion. If it's set to reduce, then in this case we can overwrite our animations. I will set this to 0.01 milliseconds, and this means that you usually don't see any moving around, any fading. It's just as without animations, and some users, they actually prefer that. So that's a nice accessibility plus here. Next, we have our body, and the body itself will start with margin unset, and we can quickly save to see if it works. And there we go, our margin has been removed. Next, I will say that our WebKit text size adjust is set to none, as well as the unprefixed version size adjust is equals to none. That is prevents some weird appearance. It's a kind of a bug in mobile Safari when zooming in and out. And this makes sure the text is still in the right size. Then we will set let's do this later. We will set a background color of our var. And now you can see that I have this body background variable here, which we'll be using, and also a color of var color text, something like that. Yeah. Looking closer, and you can see that this matches my background color in the design. Let's close this and go back to to my editor. Awesome. Next, our font family will be my main rope, of course, but I also want to select a fallback in case main rope couldn't be loaded. And let's do it like that. Looking good. And we will also set font weight to 800, since this will be set for every single element on the page. Our line height, and you can check this also by going in here. It will be, so in Figma it says that it's 38 pixels, roughly translates to 1.5. Maybe not exactly, but I don't like setting line height in pixels. I always go with this relative unit like 1.5 or 1.6, and I think 1.5 is pretty close to what the Figma design has. And then we can go over to our main component. So let's go with main and say that this is a max width, and we can get a max width from our Figma design. You can see it is 450 pixels. So let's go with 150 pixels. And additionally, I want to set a width of 100%, because it might happen that the advice that we get is really short, just 2 or 3 words. And so this would mean that the in our layout, the container, the main element, wouldn't take the entire width. It would just be as wide as it needs to display the text, but we always want to have it in the same width and stop at 550 pixels. So this ensures that it's always the same width, basically, no matter the content and the text inside. Then we will set a padding, and again we can get this padding from the Figma file. If I look here to the top, it's 48 pixels. If we go here from the text to the right, it's also 48 pixels. So it seems to be 48 pixels all around. Let's go with that. And then we also see that there is a margin on the mobile view. Come on, where is it? Here. If you select the container, you can see that the margin between the container and the outer, like the viewport, is 16 pixels. So we can say margin of 16 pixels. Then we have a background color. And again, this is our variable color card background, which is slightly lighter than my body background. Yeah, something like that. All right, we also have a box shadow, and what I like to do is I like to copy this from Figma, because this can get a bit tedious to write out. So I can select this group in here. We have our rectangle, and there it is. We have this box shadow and also the border radius. Let's copy both and paste them in the main right there. And you see this is a really odd value. It has lots of decimal places. First of all, I like to be consistent, and since we chose to go with HSL at the top, I want to convert this as an HSL value as well. And yeah, much better. 0.1, I think that's okay to go with. And then border radius 15 pixels, that's safe and looking good in our browser. And there is some console error going on. Seems like I made a mistake in our font face declaration. Yeah, because this is called manrope bold.wov2 and not manrope. Much better. Yeah. Now it's actually looking like our font is supposed to look. Cool. All right. Then we also have a text align of center. And I think that's it. Yeah. Getting closer. The next thing I want to style is our H1 element. And remember, H1 is the advice. Again, right now it's bigger because by default browser style says that the H1 is the biggest heading, then comes text and so on. In the design it's different, but that doesn't really matter. The semantical meaning is important in this case, and we can style this to whatever we want. So I will set a text transform to uppercase. We can also look in here, select the element text we see its size is 13 pixels, and we have a letter spacing, and the rest seems pretty standard. So let's say font size is 13 pixels, letter spacing, this is 4 pixels. I'm just rounding up down to 4. I don't think this 0.9 pixels is that important. And we can set a color to var accent color to give it this nice neon green. And let's have a look how this looks. Yeah, I'm happy with that. You can also see that there is a margin bottom of 24. Let's see, select that. Yeah, you see in Figma it says 24 pixels to the bottom, and by default this already has a margin, though it might not be what we want. So first of all, I want to get rid of the top margin and only have the bottom margin. So we will choose to select margin block, and the top one is 0 and the bottom one is 24 pixels, like that. And if you don't know what margin block means, margin block is a logical property like margin inline or padding inline, and this addresses the top and bottom margin. So 0 for the top, 24 for the bottom. Margin inline would be the left and right margins. You could also go with margin and then say 0 is top, to the right it's 0, to the bottom it's 24, and to the left it's also 0. But I like to go with those logical properties. I think they're really nice and they have some other benefits besides that. So now you can see that we have a proper bottom margin. Awesome. Next, let's go with our block quote. And by default, block quote elements in many browsers, they have this margin around. I don't want that, so I just say margin unset. And yeah, I think that is looking good. Next, we need a custom font size, which again we can get from Figma. And this one is 28 pixels. It's quite large. So let's say font size is 28 pixels. And it also has a letter spacing of negative 0.3 pixels. Really slightly. Cool. And something that you can also see here is that the quote has this quotation mark at the beginning and at the end. And so what I could do is I could write this quote inside my HTML like so, but the quotes from the AdviceLib API, the advices themselves, they don't have this quote. So yeah, I'm not a fan of putting this inside the HTML. I would much rather have this as part of my CSS styling. So one neat way to do this is to use the before and after pseudo elements, which means that I can go and say block quote before, and we can say content in here. And again, I could use this quote from my this default quote, and the same for the after element. And if we check this out, it looks like that, which is quite nice, but you can see that there are different quotation marks, and this design uses the, I don't know how to call it, the more elegant one. So what I like to do is, I don't know how to get this from my keyboard. I think there is also an HTML code for that. I like to go and search for HTML quotation mark, and let's see if we can find it in here. Let's go with W free scrolls. Do we find something to copy and paste? Not really. What is this? Yeah, I think this is the one that we want. So it's slightly different, and we could also use this code for it, but I'm just going to paste it over into my content property. Something like that. If I save that and go back, now it looks like my design. I think it's the same if we look at that. Yeah, looking good. And now I can still select the text, you see, but I can't select this quotation mark, which I think is fine. But I don't want to worry about it all the time when updating the advice. So I think this is the best way to solve that. Cool. Then next, let's go over to our separation here. Our what is it? Our separator. This line. And so let's close this, go back and make it a bit bigger so we can see everything. And for that, I will target my HR element. And the first thing to do is to unset the border. Oh, this appears. Then I will go into my SVG file. It's desktop first. And let's see, it has a height of 16 pixels, which means that I want to give the same height to the element to make sure that the entire SVG is displayed. And then next step is to set the background of transparent, which is the background color. Then we use the URL and say that images and pattern divider desktop SVG is my background image. And then we have no repeat and finally center. Awesome. Now this has a height of 16 pixels. It fits right in and it still has a default margin. So it's time to fix that again by setting the margin block logical property. Oops, not like that. Margin block, and this will be again copied from the design. Let's see what we have. So to the top it's 40 pixels and the bottom it's also 40 pixels. It's the same. Nice. So then we can shorthand this to 40 pixels. Let's go back, save. There we go. And then finally we have our button, which is going to be fun to style. I like to style buttons, I don't know why. Let's select the button, and first we set a background of var accent color. We set it to a width and height defined by our design. It's 40, no, it's 64 by 64 pixels. So let's go with 64, and so there are again two options here. You could also go with height and 64 pixels, which is fine. Another more modern approach is to set an aspect ratio of 1, which does the same. It's a quite new CSS property. I really like it. Yeah, it depends. It's a personal preference. You just have to update one value if you want to change the width and height like that, and you don't have to worry about finding the height. Really a bit derived example, but yeah, you can go with either setting the height or aspect ratio to 1, which means that the width and height will be the same. Then we don't have any padding, so we unset that. We also don't have any margin, which we also unset. We don't want a border, unset, looking good. But we want to have it rounded completely to be a circle, so we can set border radius of 50% and a cursor of pointer, because right now buttons have a cursor of, I don't know, it's a default one by default. So this has the nice cursor now. And then next, let's go into placing it at the bottom. You can see that it is slightly moved down out of the container element. So I would say it's 50% off, and it sticks over the edge, which means that it's a nice, or like one option to use is the transform property, and we can say that we want a translate of y, and then this will be let's say 100%. Oh, not like that. 100%. Looking good. The problem with that is when using transform and translate to move elements around, the space that they originally, without using transform, used to take is still reserved, sort of. And so if I move this down further, 120, 130, eventually we will get to our design, but then I would have to tinker with the padding bottom, or maybe find a way to find the right size, the right height of this container and the spacing. So one alternative that we can do is to set position of absolute, like that. And then we will say bottom 0. And now at the bottom 0 means that it's going to be pushed at the bottom of the viewport of the page, because with position absolute, it refers to the body element. And so if we want to refer to our main element, we have to set a position of relative in here. So now bottom 0 relates to the bottom edge of this container. But bottom 0 is not really what we want, because we want to have it sticking a bit over the edge, which means that we can get transform enabled again and say translate y 50%. Yeah, awesome. 50% means that half, like this button is 64 pixels in height, so half of that is 32 pixels. It will be pushed down by 32 pixels. This is what this basically means. But you can still see that it is not centered on the x-axis, on the y-axis. It should be right under this divider section, right in the center. So we can set a left of 50%. But this will not really work, because 50% again, it basically starts, or the 50% start at the left side of this button. So right here, where my mouse cursor is, you can see that it's at 50%, which means that we have to push it to the left by 32 pixels again, similar to what we did with our x-axis alignment. So what we can do here is to get rid of the y, which means we just translate, and then we need a second value, which actually goes first, like so, minus 50%. So translate is a shorthand for translate x, y, and z, and the first value is it's the x value, sorry. I always confuse those. Then we have the y value, and then we have the z value, but this is not being set. So this way we can nicely align it at the center. And even if we would update our size to, say, 120 pixels, it would still be in the center. And this is the advantage of hard coding it. If you would go with bottom of whatever, 64 pixels, in this case, it's dynamic to the size of this button, which I think is really, really nice. And with that, I think we have the base design, but you can also see that in our Figma, it is aligned in the center of the page. So let's quickly take care of that. Right now it's not. I will go up to my body and say that we want display of grid and align, no, it's not align, it's place items of center. And this is a common problem. Right now it's aligned on the x-axis, but we also want it aligned on the y-axis. Well, this doesn't work because the body, if you look into the inspector, the body is as high as it needs to be for the content to fit in. So it doesn't go to the bottom. What we need is a min height of 100 VH. This tells the browser or the body to be as high as the viewport. And if we make this smaller or bigger, it then goes with that accordingly. But we still have our scroll bar in case the body is, or the viewport is not high enough to display everything. Cool. And one thing I noticed is that we have a nice margin top, and we will also have a nice margin left and right. Or not. Okay, so we have to tackle two problems. The first one, margin top, is okay, but this button is sticking right to the edge of my viewport. I want to have some breathing room and to make it look a bit better. And it doesn't seem to respect my margin left and right, which I set in here. So let's tackle margin left right first. And this is because we set width of 100%, which means that it takes the entire width and the margin is getting crushed by that. One easy fix for that is to say that we need a calculation. And from those 100%, we want to divide 16 pixels on the left and on the right. So 32 pixels. Let's see. Yes, this is looking much better. Now we have the same margin on the left and right as we have on the top. And finally, we have the bottom margin. In this case, let's see, what can we do here? We can say 16 margin bottom. Let's double this by 42. Still not enough. Let's go with 64. Yeah, looking much better. So let's put this into one property. So 16 at the top, 16 at the right, 64 at the bottom, and then again 16 on the left. Let's remove this one. And there we have our nice spacing. We can maybe go back to something a bit smaller, like 48. Yeah, perfect. I think that's what I like to see. Cool. The next thing I want to tackle is my responsiveness. Right now this is looking good on bigger screens, but notice that once it gets smaller, it looks a bit weird, doesn't it? And in our design, we can see that there are some slight adjustments to the mobile view. First of all, the spacing, the padding in here, where is it? It's a bit smaller, it's 24 pixels now, and the font size also has been reduced from 28 to 24 pixels. So yeah, a few things we can do to make this look better on smaller devices. I will start with a media query, put this maybe at the bottom, and let's go with media max width, not like that. Let's say 500 pixels for now. And the first thing that we need is our padding for the main element, right? And let's see, we have right now it's 48. In here it's going to be 24, so reduced by that. We can say padding 24, and let's make it a bit smaller. Yeah, I think this is looking nice. And let's go with our block quote next and set the font size to 24 pixels. Looking good. And the design files also ship with a pattern divider mobile for smaller viewports. So let's select our HR element and update the background image to URL. And this points to images and our pattern divider mobile. Let's see how this looks. And it's a bit smaller. It's good, I think. Looking nice. Let's see, I think I like that. Yeah. Looking pretty close to what we have here in Figma. Cool. And one thing I think I forgot is to set a color to our dice icon. Right now it's black because that's the default color for the button. We want to have color of var color. What is it? Card background? No, that's too light. I think it's the body background. Yes. Cool. Looking much better now. And I think that's it with our responsive styling. Not much to see here. Yeah, I like that. Next, I want to go over to my transitions and animations. I think I want to start with the button itself. Right now there is nothing to see. There is an outline on focus, but that's it. So let's add a nice animation for the button. And I will go down and create a new section. Like so. Call this animations. Okay. And so let's think about this. I have this pulsation, this pulse animation in mind, which you saw on the final solution. I think I'll go with that. So let me first create my keyframes. Keyframes identifier, let's call it pulse. And this will start from 0%. And I will work with the box shadow here. And I'm taking this more or less from the design. If you go down here, you can see that the group 4, where is it? The button. It's group 3, shape. It has this, no, this is the icon, the oval here. It has the box shadow of 0, 40, and then our accent color. So let's take that. It's 0, 40 pixel, and then var accent color. But we don't want to start with that. So 0% means that it's the start of the animation. And this should not have the box shadow yet. So it's set to 0. And then at next, we go to 50%. Like that. Then in here, at 50%, we can now set the box shadow to a size of 40 pixels. And then as the third and last key point, we can go to 100% and set this to 0 again. If I save this and hover, nothing happens because we haven't used this yet. And I like to add some utility classes for each animation. So we can call this pulse. And then we can say that the animation name is pulse, duration. Let's give this, what should we do? 2 seconds. You know what? In this case, since this is triggered by hover and focus actions, I don't want to have a utility class. I will use this on our button directly. So we have animation, pulse, duration. Let's go with 1, maybe 2 seconds. The timing function is linear, and that's it. We don't need anything else. Let's save. And there we go. Looking good, but we want to repeat it. It shouldn't just stop after the first time. So let's say infinite. And this should now loop over. Awesome, I like that. But to be true to our design, we don't want that all the time, only on hover. So what I will do is to extract that to button, colon hover, paste it here, save it. And so once I hover over, nice. Now we have the animation only on hover. But what about focus? We also have to think about users who can't use the mouse or don't want to. They should be able to focus the button, and it should be clear that this button is selected right now. Even though we have the outline, it doesn't really stick out. It's not really visible. So I want to improve that. Let's go with button, focus, and first, I don't want the pulse animation on focus because I think it's good on hover, but not when it is selected by the keyboard. So let's just copy this here and paste it inside my focus selector. And now if I select it with my keyboard, looking nice. We can add a little transition for box shadow. Let's go with 0.2 seconds and make it linear. Yeah, I like that. But you can also see that there is this blue outline. It will look different on browsers like Chrome or Safari. And let's make this consistent and also a bit more visible. Let's say outline of 2 pixels solid, and let's give it our text color. Let's see. Much better. Yeah. Now it sticks out. It's more visible. And if I hover, I can still see the nice pulsation animation. But you know what? If I click it, yeah, you see, well, I hover, but then once I click, I will see my outline, which is okay, but I prefer not to have it while using the keyboard. So we can change focus to focus visible. And This still works when I select it with my keyboard, but once I click it, it will not use, or it will not display the outline. Much nicer. Awesome. That's my first animation done. We have others, of course, for the transition in and out of my quote and my advice. But before we can do that, in order to see it, I think we first should wire up our JavaScript logic to fetch the API, to fetch the quotes and update our content. So why don't we go ahead into our script.js and start writing some JavaScript. And so what I like to do first is use strict to tell the browser that this is modern JavaScript, and I want to wrap everything in a iffy asynchronous function just to scope my functions and my variables so they don't bleed out into my global namespace, to encapsulate that a bit better. Then we will need 3 variables. We will need our button, we will need our advice ID, which is this number at the top in my heading, and we will need our quote, which is the actual block quote element. And the button again is this one at the bottom. And so there are different ways to get these. For the button, we could say document.getElements by tag name, select button. And since this is an array of all buttons, but you just have one, we can go with 0. But I have another approach to that. And what I like to do is, in my HTML, I like to go and give it data attributes, like data action, something like that. And this indicates that the this element, this button, is used in my JavaScript, and it has an action behind that. So I could say refresh is my action name, and then I can go over into my JavaScript and say query selector, which is an awesome method. And then I can say data action, and actually let me change that to single quotes. So we can say action equals refresh. Close the square bracket, get rid of that, and voila, we have our button selected. And I will do the same for my advice ID and quote. So we have query selector, and then in this case it's not an action that's behind because the user will not interact with it. Rather we want to bind the content to when the new advice has been fetched. So I can say data bind, and this will be advice ID. And then we have the same for our quote. Document.query selector, data bind, and this will be our quote. And let's not forget to set this in our HTML. Block quote is data bind, and this has quote. And so for this one, it's a bit, that's a bit tricky. If you look into the JSON slip API, we can open this REST example, and you will see this is our structure that we get back from the API. So we have an ID property, which is just a number, and we have the advice property with our actual quote. So there is no advice pound and then the number. Instead, we don't want to update this title all the time, because then I would have to set this in JavaScript. Like I would have to write text content equals advice pound and then the number. We can make it a bit simpler, and we can wrap this inside a span and put the number inside here. And then we can give it the data bind of advice ID. So then I don't have to worry about adding some more text when updating the element. I can just output the number straight away. And I think this is pretty awesome. Cool, let's go back. Let's save both files. We can close this one, open our inspector again, go into the console, and let's see. Next, what we have now is we need to wait the trigger loading this new advice. And there are 2 steps. The first one is to trigger on page load, and second is to trigger while clicking the button. I will start by clicking the button. So let's say button.add event listener, click, and we will have a handle click function. You could also have an inline function, but I like to specify it as an explicit function so that it doesn't get created each time we click the button to save some memory. It's a bit more efficient and nicer to work with, I think. And so in here we go and fetch advice. And so for that I will have another function called fetch advice. So before we can use that, let's actually build it. Fetch advice. Which means that we want to use our fetch API. And whenever using fetch API in JavaScript, I recommend using the try catch block to catch any errors like network issues, or in case something unexpected happens. It's always a good practice to wrap code that may fail inside the try catch block. So let's say try catch exception without the dot in between, and let's go and say const response equals await fetch. Do I still have it in my clipboard? No, I don't. So we go over, copy this API URL, paste it in, and we can then say if my response is okay. This is a property of the response object that we get back from this fetch call. So if everything is okay, status code is 200 or 201, then okay is true. Otherwise, if it's 404 or 500, this means that okay is false and we can handle our error properly. So if response okay, otherwise we do something here. And if it's okay, since we get back some JSON from the API, we want to parse it. So we can say const JSON equals await response.json. And let's see, I think we can test this already. I will just put a console log here just in case something goes wrong. And then we can console log this out to see what is happening. And don't forget to wire this up. So we have to say fetch advice in here. Let's see. There we go. Object gets logged inside my console. Let's open it, and then as expected we have a slip property, and this one is another object with the advice and its ID. Awesome. Then we can go ahead and we can set this into our body. So what I will do is I will create a new function, set new advice, something like that, and I want to receive my ID and advice from the object. And then we can say advice ID dot text content equals ID. And we also have quote dot text content equals advice. So we can go ahead and we can call this function set new advice. And remember, JSON, it has the slip property, and the slip property in return has ID and advice, which will be destructured in our set new device function call function. Let's save, press the button, voila, looking cool. We have advice number 75, and you will always regret the round of tequila, which I can confirm. That's definitely true. Awesome. Let's press it again, but nothing happens. Let's see. Let's investigate the issue. We have our network tab here. Clear it out, maybe press it, and it seems that this is cached. So if we go into the response, yes, it's the same body that we have. Yeah, it's always the same body, which means that Firefox or the API perhaps, they are doing some caching in the background. And this results in it not being updated. Let's try Chrome quickly and see if Chrome behaves the same. Localhost 5000, updated. Yeah, in here it works. So Chrome does a different approach to caching, it seems. This is a bit weird, but let's see. One thing that is pretty straightforward to do is we can set a cache property to the fetch object. And you see there are multiple options here. We have default, which is implicitly default, force cache, no store. I think I will go with reload. And let's see. Let's go back to Firefox, refresh, just in case. First time, second time. Yeah, I think now it works. Yeah, this is a bit weird. I'm not sure what's going on in Firefox, but I think this is a nice workaround to make it load a new advice after each click. And by the way, this advice slip ID, this advice slip JSON API, it has a repeat request within 2 seconds, return in the same piece of advice. So there is some caching on their side. If you press within 2 seconds, then it will be the same, but after 2 seconds, you should see a new advice. Okay, interesting. But we have this figured out, I think. Then I also want to handle my errors, because it might happen that something goes wrong. We can simulate this by entering an invalid URL, like advice 2. And now I will say that it failed. You can see there's a 4.4, but nothing happens. And this is really bad UX for the user. If something goes wrong, let them know that something didn't work, and maybe they can try later, or you can give some email address to contact your help desk. So this is a good best practice to always have error handling. So in this case, I think we could see the error in here. Let's say failed to load. Let's try again. Yes, failed to load. So we handle our not okay response in the else block. I want to just throw an error, throw a new error, and let's say this is a template string, could not fetch advice, and then we can give it some more information. This is up to you, response.status, which will be 4.4 in this case, and then we have a response.status text, which is not found, and it's the same that you can see in here in your inspector. And we can maybe tell the user to please try again later. Something like that. So throwing this error will escalate down into the catch block. And in here, we catch all the errors, not only the ones from the response, but also if anything else went wrong, like fetch couldn't succeed or anything like that. We will always catch it in our catch block. And then in here we can say we have a function called display error message, and we pass in the exceptions message. Exception, this is an error object, and all error objects in JavaScript have a message property, which is our text that we just set here. Let's go on top and say function display error message. It receives my error message. And what do we want to do with that? I think I just want to display it inside my quote. You could also have a snack bar or toast or some other element on the page, but for simplicity purpose, I will just update my quote text content to contain this error message. Like so. Let's try. Yes, could not fetch advice, 4.4 not found, please try again later. I think that's much nicer. Now the user can see that at least something went wrong, instead of it being not responsive at all and the user being left behind guessing why it doesn't work. But I also don't want this to be so big. This is the big text, the big font size is for our quote. If it's an error, I think I want just the default 16 pixels of font size. Yeah, because otherwise, you never know. Maybe the user thinks this is an actual quote, like, yeah, I don't know, but I think setting a font size of 16 pixels is okay in here. So what I want to do is set a class, quote.class list dot add, and then we have a class called has error. And this doesn't do anything right now. If I try again, you can see that it is set in my body, in my block quote has error, but we don't do anything with it. So let's go back to our CSS and how do we do that? I think I want to extract that slightly. So let's say we have block quote, and then we say it should not have the class of has error. Nice selector. So this is only being applied when the block quote does not have a has error class. Otherwise, it is left out, and we can move these two to the bottom. Let's refresh. Yeah, so right now it doesn't have any class. It's okay. It's big size. And now once we have an error, it's smaller. It's good. And I also want to remove the quotation marks because clearly it's not a quote. It's an error message. So we can just copy this over to our before and after selectors. Yes, I think this is much nicer. And yeah, now we have some proper error handling, and we can go back to setting my URL to advice. Restore that. Let's try again. Still working. Awesome. But you also notice that we have this default lorem ipsum text. Of course, I don't want that. I want to fetch my first advice after loading the page. So we can just go in here and say fetch advice. And this is why I extracted that in a separate function. So I can call it from anywhere. This is nice, but there is this weird layout shifting because I still have my lorem ipsum text. So let's go in here, remove that. You can either leave it blank or you can put something like loading inside. It doesn't really matter. This API is quite fast. Yeah. In case you have a really slow network, I think leaving the loading in is nice. That way users know that something is happening, hopefully in the background. And yeah, then we can update it again. Cool. There's also something that I think is really important to do, and this is notifying screen readers that something has happened here, that the content has updated. And thanks to area attributes, we can make this a bit easier for screen readers. So there are two elements that will update your content: the advice and advice ID and my advice itself. And we can set the area live attribute and set it to assertive. Same for block quote. Let's put this in here. And this won't change any behavior, but users or screen readers will be notified. It will announce that the content has updated once the button has been clicked and the new advice has been fetched. And this is really important for screen readers to make sure that they don't miss any updates on the page. Yeah, cool. And I think all that's left is having some nice animations, which is not so easy in itself, especially since we go without any library or any helpers, but I think it's doable. So let's try and tackle our animations in here. Let's start by having this fade out animation that you saw in the initial in the final solution. I can show it to you again. If you look in here and you press the button, it kind of scales back a little bit, then it turns to the right and it fades out at the same time. And then once we have this new advice, we again come from the left, we slide in, we zoom in a bit, and it also fades in at the same time, something like that. So I think this is the first one that I want to do. So let's tackle that in here. Let's start by writing our keyframes in the animation section. And what I want to do is I want to have a new keyframe, and I call this slide out X. X because it's on the X-axis, so makes sense. And then let's see, we will start by 0% and not O but 0, and we have an opacity of 1. Next we will go to maybe 50%, and let's say that opacity should be 0. No, it should still be 1, I think. Yeah, it should be 1. But we want to scale back my text, my quote. So we say scale 0. Let's say 0.8 for now. And then we go to 100%. And now I want to hide this. I want to fade it out by setting the opacity to 0. And I still want to be... So by then I want this scaling or this zooming out to be finished. So let's say it's 0.8 still, nothing should change anymore, but I want to move it to the right. And then we can say translate X to 70%. Let's see if this works. I can just go into my HTML and update my class here to say, yeah, I have to add a class first. So let's go into my top and say slide, not side, but slide out X. Set my animation to slide out X, duration, let's say it's 0.6 seconds, and we want to ease in, out. And I want to have the fill direction to be forwards, which means that it will stay the same until we move the class again. Slide out X. And yeah, I think this is looking good. Let's save it. Let's see. This didn't quite work. Let's see, slide out X. I forgot to set it in here. Slide out X. Yeah, I think this is looking good. Let's refresh. Okay, maybe let's tweak it a little bit by going a bit more out, like so. Yeah, I like that. It's still, it's a bit flashy because we have a loading text being replaced, but let's not worry about that. Maybe make this a bit more like that. I like that. One issue I see is that for longer text, if we fade out and slide to the right, it overflows my container, and I don't want that. I want it to be cut off by the container so it doesn't bleed out. I think this might look weird with bigger quotes, and so we want to have a clean cut. It shouldn't go over my container. I assume that, let's see, we have main, one way would be to say overflow to hidden, but this brings another issue. You see it is now cut off, it is not overflowing anymore here, but also the button isn't overflowing, which I don't want. So let's go back into our HTML and let's give this a wrapper div and, oops, not like that, div class equals quote container. Let's put this inside. Yeah. And then we can give overflow to this container, and it will not affect my button and all the rest. So let's see, I can save this again to revert back. And then we can go into my CSS and say quote container. And this one is overflow X, and it's hidden. Let's see. How does this look? Yeah, I mean, typing is required in order to have this work, of course. So let's see, that's looking better, but I don't like that there is a padding. It should be cut off at the corner of the container and not in this inner container. So since we have a padding around it, this padding is 48 pixels. We can say that the margin inline properties are minus 48 pixels. Something like that. Yeah, much better. But if we quickly remove our animation class and let's refresh. Yeah, there it is. You see now our negative margin basically negated the padding that we have on the main component on the container. So we have to restore our padding by saying that padding inline, which means left and right, should again be 48 pixels. And there it is. Much better. Now we have our original padding back. But if we enable our animation class again, yes, now it will be cut off right at the corner of my main component. I like it. And the same, we need something similar for the sliding in animation once we have a new advice. So let's copy this, call it slide in X. And so let's see, we will start from a opacity of 0. And we want a transform by default, which is translate X minus 70%. So it's the same value as here, but it's not pushed to the right, but to the left instead. Okay. And this means that we also have the scaling, right? Because initially it's scaled down, but then we want to scale it up to 1. So let's go with 0.7 again. And this is looking good. And now, so it's a bit tricky to wrap your head around it, but we have to do this animation backwards. So in this case, 100 to 40, this is 60%. So we have to update this to 60% instead. And then opacity 1 is okay. We need that. Scale should still be 0.7, but our translate X is now set to 0 because it's now in its original position. And then the final 40%, which are from here to here, we can just set our scale to 1 and remove translate X instead. And this should work, I think. Let's save and update our class to in. Let's see, does this work? No, it doesn't, because we don't have a class yet for that. I always forget it. Slide in, animation is also slide in, same time, in and out, and we don't need forwards this time because this is already at its desired position. So there will nothing will be changing here after the animation is done. Let's see. Yeah, I like that. This is looking good. Nice. Let's make this work in JavaScript. We don't want to have the class initially. Save that. Back to normal. Let's go into our script. And let's see. I want to have two functions for that. The first one is slide or fade in, or maybe animate in, and then animate out. So let's say animate in, and function animate out, like that. Let's start with animate out, because this is the first thing we can see after pressing the button. So animate out, let's say we have, how do we do that? Because you have to keep in mind we will work with set timeouts, something like that. So we have our set timeout code in here, setting classes, it's doing stuff, and this timeout will be the same value, or it will wait as long as our animation takes. in our animations in here is 0.6 seconds. So we need to wait 600 milliseconds to make things work. And it works like that. So we click the button, we want to fade it out, then we want to update the text. And once it is updated, which means we also have to wait for the REST API to return a new advice. Once we have that, we can then fade it in again. But I think the first step is to fade it out. And we have to wait those 600 milliseconds. And then we can start and updating the content in here. So if we handle the click in here, we want to call animate out. And I think we can work with promises because let's say we have animate out, we wait 600 milliseconds, and then once the animation is completed, then we can fetch our advice. Something like that. Yeah, I think this should work. Let's go and try it out. Let's say we return a new promise. This doesn't reject, so it just has a resolve parameter. And in here, let's see, what can we do? First set timeout, and timeout will call resolve after 600 milliseconds. Like so. Let's try this. Awesome. You see, we have this delay of 6 milliseconds. So this is the time our animation will take to fade out this text. And then if this is done, resolve is called, and resolve means that then we can fetch the advice, which is cool. So let's add some classes in this case. We want to add a class to our quote, class list.add. And let's say that this is slide out X as we had it before. Let's save. Press it. Nice. I like that. Let's refresh, try it again. Cool. Now you can see that we have our class still being applied in here. Yeah, this is good. This is good. The next step is, I think, to animate in. So what we have to do is we have to replace our class name from slide out X to slide in X, which means that we can say quote.classlist.replace. And this classes API is really awesome. It is making working with classes in JavaScript really, really easy. So we can replace the slide out X with our slide in X instead. It's awesome. And additionally, yeah, let's leave it for that with that for now. Let's see. So we have our animate out. It calls resolve. Resolve is then the fetch advice. Fetch advice goes ahead, fetches our actual advice, and then once we have that, we set new advice. We call this function. So I think that once we have updated text, we can animate in again. And let's try this. Yeah, it worked the first time. Let's try again. I think that's what we want. Now we can see that slide in X is persisted, and if we press again, nothing happens. That's because, yeah, we have to remove slide in X after the animation is done. So what we can do is we can add another set timeout, and this one is again after 600 milliseconds, and we can just remove our class. So quote.class list.remove, and then it's slide and X is going to be removed. Let's try it again. It's gone. I think this is sweet. It looks nice. YOLO. That's what I think. Awesome. Yeah. I think that's It's already done. One thing we have to check, how does this behave with errors? Let's say we have an invalid URL again. Okay, yeah, there was still a bug. So if we press the button and something went wrong, we get our invalid URL. It is not fading in or sliding in, slide out X. I think this is because text content, let's see. Yeah, because if something goes wrong, we don't call set new advice, which in return would call animate in. We also have to call it when we display an error message right here. So if I save that, and now it works. Whenever we have an error, we also fade in our error nicely. Yeah, quick and simple fix for that. Cool. Next, let's go to our advice ID. Remember, in here, this is also animated. It's not left to right or right to left. It's from top to bottom. And so let's write the keyframe for that. Go back into our styles. And this one will be called keyframes slide down, maybe? Slide down. Or we could also say slide out Y to be more explicit. Yeah, so this means that it is sliding down on the Y-axis. I think I like that name better. In here, we don't need 3 keyframes, we just need 2. So we can say from and we can say to. And this will animate from an opacity of 1 to an opacity of 0. And it will also transform by translating on the y-axis from 0 to translate y. I don't know, let's say 100%. Let's see how this looks. We have to also create a new class, slide out y. Animation name is slide out y. Duration 0.6 again, and this can also be ease in out. And also it's forwards, like the one above. Okay, let's give it a try. And we will set this on our span, not the h1, because we only want to update the number, not the entire title. Class slide, now come on, slide out y. Okay, this looks a bit weird. So it's fading out, but it is not sliding down. Let's see, let's debug that. Maybe remove the class. What if I set my transform directly? Let's say transform translate y and say 100%, and this doesn't work. I wonder if this is because span is set to display inline by default. What happens if I say inline block? Ah yeah, okay. So this appears to be because of inline block of the display setting. So a quick fix would be to go up to our h1 and say h1 span display of inline block. I think that should fix it. Let's put this class back, save, and refresh. Yeah, much nicer, but I think it's way too much. We can tune this down a little bit by going, what is it? Maybe 50%. Yeah, I think it's more elegant. 50% less movement. We don't want to overdo it. And I will maybe change this to 400 milliseconds. It's a bit difficult to see because of the loading, but I think this is much better. Quickly, let's type out our keyframes for the slide in Y animation. Slide in, and this will go from opacity 0 and we have a negative transform y on 50%, to opacity 1, and translate y 0. So it's just reversed. And again, we need a class for that. Awesome. And let's remove the class here because we want to set this dynamically in our JavaScript. So we can go inside here, first animate out. We already have advice ID. Remember, it is a variable that we have set up on top of our function. It's advice ID dot class list dot add slide out y. And then we can copy that. Actually, this is animation out, right? Animation in, we can actually copy this one. Makes more sense. Change this to advice ID class list, and then we can replace X with Y. Let's see how this looks. And I forgot to also remove it. So advice ID class list remove, slide out is not the one, let's slide in. Let's see. I like it. That's what I want to see. Nice. One final animation I would like to add is on the button itself, the dice icon that we have, the SVG. In here, it's just rotation. So it's a little bit like throwing the dice, a little rotation action here, nothing fancy. Let's quickly write this out in our CSS. Can call this at keyframes maybe spin, and then we can go from transform rotate 0 degrees, and we go to transform rotate 360 degrees. So it's spinning around a few times, and then that's it, nothing fancy. Let's call it spin animation spin duration, I don't know, maybe 600 milliseconds. And this can be ease out, so it has this nice easing out effect that you saw on the demo. And let's go back into our JavaScript, and this should not be inside the animate in or out functions, but rather whenever we click our button. So we can say button dot class list dot add spin. This did not work for some reason. Let's see. Let's debug this quickly. It is not setting my class, is it? What did I do wrong? Data action refresh. Button class list add spin. This is weird. This is weird. I wonder what happens if I put this in the animate out function. Maybe it's the right place. I'm not sure though. Spin. Let's try this. Okay, yeah, this looks better. Sort of looking better. There is a bug that we can address in a couple of seconds. Yeah. Okay, this is good. So what is happening? The button is moving around, it's jumping on the page because there are two transformations colliding. We have the transformation from my animation, which is setting the rotation, and on the other hand, our button has the transform translate because we want to position it at the bottom center of the container. So instead, what we could do is we could just set the transition to the animation to our SVG instead. So we can say spin SVG like that. And this should work. Again, we have the same issue. The second or third or following times it's not doing anything. That's because the class already is on here and we have to remove it once the animation is complete. So let's go into this animate out, set timeout. Yeah, I think let's put it inside here. Button.class list, not last, that remove spin. Let's see. Now it's working. Cool. This is nice. I really like this transition and animation stuff. Gives it a nice UX and makes it look sweet. There is one thing, however, to consider, and that is our animation preference that the user can set. As you might remember, we set a media query in our CSS for preferred reduced motion, and we want to do the same for JavaScript, because if a user decides to disable their animations or their motion in browsers, we don't need all those timeouts. It will just delay things unnecessarily, and we can basically set 600 to 0 because there is no animation going on. So one nice way to do that is to set a constant animation timeout, and by default it's 600. So we can replace every occurrence of 600 with this constant. But we want to determine if a user has this reduced motion setting enabled or not. And for that, we have a nice API in JavaScript. You can see it by typing in the console. You can call window.matchMedia. And in here, you can basically pass in this media query that we have with the brackets. So if we copy that over inside our JavaScript console, it returns a media query list object, and this one has a matches property, which is a boolean, either true or false. I don't have reduced motion enabled, so it's false for me, but any user who enables reduced motion, for them it would be true. So we can look for that in our JavaScript, and we can create a new constant, and let's call it prefers reduced motion, and this has our matches property on it. And then in here we can have a ternary operator, let's say reduced motion. If so, our animation timeout is 0, otherwise it's 600. So users that don't want animations, they will not see any of that, and they will have a more swift and faster refreshing of our advices in this list. And okay, this is looking really good. Let's have a quick check on mobile devices again. Let's see, how does this look? Oh, there is something going on. You can see that it is overflowing again. I think this is because of our updated padding. Yes. Remember, in style CSS, we have a padding of 48 pixels by default, but in our media query at the bottom, it reduced to 24 pixels. And so we have to consider that when using our quote container, because right now it's hard-coded to 48 pixels. One way to fix that, because I don't want, I could also address quote container inside here and update my margin and padding properties to 24 pixels instead. But a much more elegant solution would be to create a custom property for this main element and say it's called spacing. By default, it's 48 pixels. So we can update that here to the spacing. And now we can use the same here, var spacing. And in here, it's interesting, we have a negative 48 pixels, so we can't do something like that. This is not possible. Instead, whenever you use a custom property and you want to negate it, then you can just say calc. We have our 48 and we multiply it by -1, which will not change the value, it will just negate it. So it's now minus 48 pixels. And what else for this? Okay. So in here, instead of saying padding 24, we can just say spacing equals 24 pixels and then remove the padding property. And let's check this out. So right now it's 48. It's getting smaller and it's looking good. Yes, now we have a proper cutoff. It's not overflowing and the spacing is consistent in all elements. By the way, if you wonder how this works, because we have our custom property on main and not the quote container, this works because spacing is defined on main, which has quote container as a child. So basically spacing is inherited from the previous scope from main. So it's available to all child elements. And this is how it works. Of course, if you would set something like spacing in here and give it a custom property or a custom value, then it would no longer be 48 pixels from the main element. But since we don't have any spacing declaration, we can just use from the main parent like that. And something I also want to change is all those pixel values. I mean, they work, but they are not really accessible for users that update their font size, for example, in browsers, because they want to have it bigger. They might have poor eyesight. If we just use like pixel values, then it is kind of set, it's fixed, and user preferences wouldn't be considered, which is not really accessible. Instead, we want to use as much EM and RAM values as possible because they are relative to user preferences and they work much nicer in that regard. I have an extension installed which is called px2ram from macro-n, and this allows me to just go over any px value, press Alt-Z, and this will convert it to rams. So let me quickly do that for all my values in here. 16, like that. We have my box shadow, it can be in rams as well, 80, border radius. Do we have some pixels in here? We don't. Let's go down, font size, letter spacing I will leave at 4 pixels, then this is 1.5. And also here, height, well, I will leave the 16 pixels for the height because this should be a fixed value since the SVG will not change. It will always be 16 pixels, so we don't have to consider any outer factors when calculating the height. But margin block will be set in rams. This one will be in rams. This is a percentage unit again. My media queries, I like to write them in rams or ems. I think there is a bug in Safari if you use ram values media queries, so it's better to use em as a unit, though the result is the same. It's the same with word will break. So yeah, just go with that. Then we have again 24 here. And let's see, box shadow is 40 pixels. These are all percentual units and degrees. Nice, let's save it. And it should look exactly the same. Nothing will happen, but again, users with custom preferences in terms of font size and scaling will have a better experience with our page. And I think that is looking good. I'm not sure if the font size is actually changing. It looks the same to me, so let's quickly inspect that. Block quote, font size 1.7, and on smaller screens it's 1.5. And this is not working. That's a good catch. So now this still is lacking my has not error class selector, and since the specificity on this one is higher because it is more explicit, it overrides my media query at the bottom. So what I can do is I can just update this to not has error, and now it will be smaller. Now this works. Awesome. So yeah, one last thing I would like to do is to quickly check the page if there are any issues that we might detect with some tools like Lighthouse. So I will open Chrome again and so on the page, open my inspector and go to Lighthouse. You can run a test on both desktop and mobile to make sure everything is working as expected. Let's see what the results are. Oh, that's good. So unused JavaScript. This I think is not from my, yeah, I have an extension for the XDev tools. So they are not from this page. It's just a Chrome extension. We can ignore that. Accessibility is okay. Nothing to complain about. CEO is okay. Let's run another second check for the mobile and see what Lighthouse comes up with. I bet it will be a bit lower because of this JavaScript issue, but again, nothing to worry about because yeah, this is way higher, but this is nothing to worry about because it's just a Chrome extension that other users might not have. Looking good. I would also like to run a quick check in my XDev tools, scan the entire page, and nothing came up, no issues. That's what I like to see. Awesome, let's try it out in Chrome quickly. Looking good. Let's try our keyboard. Press enter. It just works. So there we have it. This is our advice generator app, courtesy by Frontend Mentor for providing this awesome challenge with the designs and everything. I had a ton of fun building those animations and making it look and work smooth. I hope you liked it as well. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and otherwise, if you have any feedback, also please leave it there. I'm always happy to learn stuff, and if I made something wrong or something could be improved, then make sure to let me know and I will correct that in the future. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this and have a nice day. Take care. Bye.